Depth of field refers to the distance between the nearest and furthest areas in a shot that appear sharp. There are 3 factors that affect depth of field: the lens aperture, the distance the subject is from the lens, and the focal length of the lens. The aperture is the opening in a lens that lets light through to the sensor. If you have a large aperture, the depth of field will be small. With a small aperture, the depth of field will be large. In this example, the only parameter that has been changed is the aperture, and you can see how the depth of field has been affected. The image on the left was shot with an aperture of f2.8. The image on the right was shot with an aperture of f22. Note, the f number refers to the size of the aperture as a fraction of the focal length of the lens. For example, an aperture of f1 on a 50mm lens has a diameter of 50mm. Whereas on that same lens, an aperture of f10 would have a diameter of 5mm. As you move the subject closer to the lens, the depth of field decreases. And conversely, as you move the subject further away from the lens, the depth of field increases. The third factor that affects depth of field is the angle of view, known as the focal length of the lens. A wide-angle lens has a larger depth of field than a long lens if the subject remains at the same distance from the camera. However, if the subject takes up the same amount of the frame at both focal lengths, the depth of field remains the same if we are using the same aperture. So let's have a look at what's happening here. Here is our lens aperture. We are focused on our subject. There is really only one plane that is perfectly in focus, but our eyes accept an area in front of and behind that plane as being acceptably in focus. Now, watch what happens when we decrease the size of the aperture. The converging focus lines now have a more acute angle, and because of this, the area that is acceptably sharp increases and the depth of field becomes deeper. When we move the subject closer to the lens, the angles of the converging lines become less acute, decreasing the amount of the image that is acceptably sharp, thus reducing the depth of field. In summary, depth of field is a key tool that should be considered when composing a shot, and the 3 factors that affect depth of field are the lens aperture, the distance the subject is from the lens, and the focal length, or angle of view of the lens.